Hello, thank you for joining us. This is our first time doing a presentation for a carbon neutral conference, so we are excited to be part of this process. We are going to be speaking about a module that we are creating for the NxTerra website, which will be populated with climate change related curriculum. Our focus is climate change centering Indigenous perspectives. My name is Beth Rose Middleton Manning. I'm an associate professor and chair of the Department of Native American Studies at UC Davis.
And I'm Chris Adlam, a PhD candidate in ecology at UC Davis, working on the restoration of traditional fire practices in California.
First, we'd like to start with some of the themes that guide the development of our curriculum. So reframing climatic change from Indigenous perspectives requires attention to at least the following considerations. First, that Indigenous people possess a long view of place-based stewardship. People have been living in relation with and with responsibilities towards land and waterscapes since time immemorial, and they have observed changes in those over time. And this long-term view is much longer than the more recent scientific monitoring of different species, plant and animal species, and of relationships, ecological relationships. So we want to recognize the strength and duration of traditional ecological knowledge. We also want to underscore that from Indigenous perspectives, the world is composed of active and interacting beings, not just human beings, but many other types of beings. Rivers and mountains and other landforms, for example, are recognized in many Indigenous legal frameworks as having personhood. And this is really interesting in the way it's coming into tribal codes and tribal laws, recognizing that if a river is polluted, for example, then there's a harm that's being done to a being, and it can be prosecuted in a similar way that a harm can be prosecuted that's done to a human being. We must also recognize that colonialism has wrought and is wreaking apocalyptic change for Indigenous nations. So, as we'll talk about as we go forward, climate change and the huge and problematic changes we're seeing today are just another expression of the huge and problematic changes that Indigenous peoples have seen since contact and since attempted colonialism of their lands and lifeways. We also want to argue that not acknowledging Indigenous perspectives reproduces colonial epistemic and other forms of removal and violence. So the importance of recognizing that Indigenous perspectives are different from non-Native perspectives, and that they are diverse among different Indigenous nations, and that they must be recognized and heard and respected. So just a brief overview. This is one of Aaron Capella's maps showing the great diversity of Indigenous nations throughout the Western Hemisphere. This is another map focusing on the United States, because we are focusing primarily on the United States in this presentation, even though our module is international in scope. So all of the United States, what is now known as the United States, is Indigenous land, our Indigenous homelands with sacred places, with important sites to procure resources, to steward in order to produce those resources. But this map shows political recognition of tribal lands. And the bar on the top, which is from the Indian Land Working Group and the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, shows the way in which Indigenous land tenure has been reduced over time. And the question mark I see in the last image there shows, I think, the potential for Indigenous land reclamation in terms of all the work that's being done today. We are speaking particularly from California. We're both at University of California, Davis. So I'd like to emphasize that we are here within Patwin, Wintu, Southern Wintu homelands, grateful to be here, and that we are within what is now known as the state of California, which has almost 110 sovereign Indigenous nations out of a total of nearly 560 nationwide. So the most nations recognized tribes are in California. There are about 80 tribes also petitioning for recognition. California also has the highest Native population of all U.S. states, and I emphasize that statistic is constant, but the actual numbers vary based on different delineations, whether or not you're talking about Native ethnicity alone or in combination with another race or ethnicity. Despite the high number of native nations in California and the high number of native people, there's a relatively small amount of recognized native land. And that takes us to this slide. But this slide shows us the traditional territories, the traditional homelands of native people throughout California. And we'll be talking about work very briefly in a couple of different places. But as you can see, all of California is native land, and it's very densely populated landscape. This is the recognition, the political recognition of native lands in California. You can see small areas of land, and this has a lot to do with the history of California vis-a-vis native nations, the lack of ratification of treaties with California Indian people, leading to later the establishment of very small rancherias set aside for so-called homeless California Indians after they were really pushed and removed and their areas were destroyed. A state-sanctioned campaign of genocide enacted against people in the 19th century. So now very small areas of land, but people continue to exercise their responsibilities to lands throughout their homelands that are not represented on this map that shows very small areas. So briefly in this presentation, we're going to talk about Indigenous perceptions of climate change, some observations, some critiques, and engagement, emphasizing that Indigenous analyses of climate change are historically grounded, they're oriented toward justice, and that climate change is never only an ecological problem. It's an integrated issue that affects all aspects of people's lives. Also, we're underscoring Indigenous leadership and to draw on Professor Daniel Wildcat's term indigenuity or indigenous ingenuity in climate change adaptation. So Wildcat has been formative in my thinking. I often teach his book, Red Alert. He is a professor at Haskell Indian Nations University, and he writes about how he gets angry when he thinks of global warming. He knows the history of involuntary removals and relocations Indigenous peoples have endured. So when he heard the reports of what was beginning to manifest on the landscapes and seascapes of the Arctic, as this image shows, and the banks of the Yukon River in Alaska, he says, I got angry because I thought, here we go again, another removal of Indigenous peoples. So it really helps, I think, to think more deeply about the impacts of climate change and how there's a disproportionate impact on Indigenous people and an ongoing impact extending colonial era impacts, ongoing colonial impacts. So I worked on the NCA4, and a lot of this presentation is really providing resources and information that are going to be used in our module. It's not a research presentation. So in NCA4, I worked on the Southwest chapter, and my colleague, Dr. Julie Maldonado, and I looked at unique challenges facing Southwestern tribes. Among the challenges we found reduced rain, increasing aridity, increasing risk of wildfire. You can see this graph here that's included in the chapter, showing just this incredible increase in wildfires with climatic change and the impacts that has on traditional agriculture and access to traditional foods, including pine nuts, for example, and black oak acorns. Other challenges include the increase in temperature and the impacts on health. So this relates to an intersection between health issues and climate change. So if you have a lack of infrastructure and maybe high levels of poverty, people may not have the ability to have cool spaces to go to. They may not have air conditioning. So you'll see more health-related heat impacts. I'd like to recognize the work of Shasta Gahn with the Pala tribe on the California Climate Assessment, the Indigenous and Tribal Communities chapter. She wrote a short piece about health impacts of climate change. We know broadly electricity generation capacity, specifically if you rely on hydropower, which much of our electricity grid does, is impacted by drought and heat events. Specifically for Indigenous people, very high level subsistence and cultural impacts, which might include, lower levels in the river, increased algae, and people are immersing themselves in the river during ceremony, which often takes place in the summertime, and maybe exposing themselves to toxic algae, for example, and other contaminants that may be more concentrated in the water when there's less water and it's drier and hotter. So I have a couple of brief examples of the ways in which climate impacts are exacerbated by colonial history. So up north along the Klamath River and the Klamath watershed, there's a long history here of course, indigenous homelands and stewardship of the Klamath River, but then the development of these Bureau of Reclamation projects in the upper basin. I don't think my pointer there it is working here. But there were a series of projects developed in the upper basin to facilitate agriculture. Despite the tribe having the senior water right, the development of these projects means that two entities have promises by the federal government to protect their water rights. So farmers in the upper basin have commitments from a reclamation project, and tribes in the lower basin have commitments due to their status as tribal nations that water will always be in the river and that they will always be able to fish from the river. And there's also a series of dams along the river. So there's a lot of discussion about removal of these dams. 4 dams are slated to come out. But it's interesting to think about the challenges on this river system. So you have climatic change, which is impacting the level of flows. It's impacting the water quality in different ways. But you have all these other impacts on the system, including this upper basin reclamation project and all these dams. So before you can even deal with climate change and the impacts it's having downriver, you also have to look at all of these colonial era interventions, including the reclamation project and the dams. So to make the point that climate change is exacerbated by colonial developments, including dams without the tribe's consent on the upper watershed. And here's an example for the climate water deficit, the increase in wildfire. So the river is already a stress system with the dams and the agricultural use at the upper watershed. And now we're looking also at responding to climate change. Again, climate change layered atop existing impacts, looking in the southwest, in the Four Corners region, Navajo Nation, Hopi lands. So water at Navajo Nation had long been used for large-scale mining operations, now with more extreme effects of drought. Sorry, this is kind of blurry, but showing reduced streams, reduced snowpack over time, and historic drought, drawing on Margaret Red Steer's wonderful work, entire communities running out of water. So you have a system that is already impacted by the incredible drawdown of water for mining activity, and then you have drought. So the ways in which climate change builds on colonial impacts. Okay, this is drawing on the California Climate Assessment. Again, this is going to be a really important piece of the curriculum we are developing to teach students about Indigenous perspectives on climate change. This is a table developed by Professor Don Hankins, who is a professor of geography and planning at California State University, Chico. He's looking at observed phenomenon, shifting seasons, fire impacts to fisheries, how Indigenous people are seeing this, noting what's happening from detailed observation and relationship and being on the land, and the significance. What are the impacts of this process of change, of climate change? What are the impacts? So he's done some really important work, and we have been working to incorporate this into a curriculum. So some policy critiques from Indigenous perspectives. We want to underscore that policymaking in the climate arena requires Indigenous voices and leadership so as not to reproduce neocolonial exclusions. And this is an example of a quote from Alberto Salmonando from Indigenous Environmental Network and International Indian Treaty Council, critiquing the Paris Accord and in particular REDD projects, which involve carbon offsets and certain types of land stewardship to sequester carbon in forests, and countries are receiving payment through this framework of REDD by preserving forests and following these land management protocols that are monitored to pull greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. So if these projects are developed without Indigenous people at the table, they can result in people being removed from their homelands, in the barring of Indigenous stewardship, even though it's Indigenous stewardship that is as we have been documenting the most extensive way to combat climate change. And we have seen examples. I bring this up just to say that tribes are also using carbon offsets, but when tribes design the program of carbon sequestration, it is with a goal of justice, of protecting tribal homelands, of ensuring access, of ensuring the ability to steward in many cases. But if these programs are developed without tribes, it often reproduces those relationships of removal and exclusion. There are many actions taking place, positive responses to address climate change impacts and vulnerabilities. This is an image from the NCA4 National Climate Assessment from our Southwestern chapter. And I bring it up to highlight in the upper left corner, cultural fire restoration is highlighted up in Northwestern California, and Chris will be talking about that a bit more in terms of the Yurok tribe's work. This is a map from the National Climate Assessment, a map of Indigenous peoples' climate resilience actions, and you can access an interactive version of this map through the Bureau of Indian Affairs website, and there's a link there below. But this is a really excellent map that shows different Indigenous-led climate resilience actions in different categories, from planning to governance and capacity building to monitoring and research all over the United States. And we are looking to see if there's a similar map that documents international work by different Indigenous nations. So I'm going to pass the mic to Chris now.
For thousands of years, in California and across the world, Indigenous people have intentionally applied fire to the landscape for a variety of reasons, including in hunting, in creating habitat for the animals that they hunt, to promote the growth of plants that are important for food and basketry and other purposes, to create travel routes, to increase visibility, to maintain safe communities and prevent catastrophic fires, and as a spiritual obligation to keep the land healthy. However, 20th century fire suppression policies criminalized this practice, and forced assimilation policies further threatened the continuity of this knowledge. Yet today, across the Southwest and across the world, we see active revitalization efforts that bring together tribes, non-governmental organizations, and state and federal agencies to help restore a practice that maintains healthy landscapes and communities. It is worth mentioning that tribal leadership today in prescribed fire means that tribal lands are the only place that we are seeing an increased use of prescribed fire, even though scientists and agencies and experienced practitioners know that we need to use this tool ever more today to prevent catastrophic wildfires. So tribal leadership in this arena is very important. There are a variety of reasons why it is important to involve tribes in fire management today. Tribes have a sophisticated body of traditional fire knowledge, and they are also experts in their own landscapes. This means that fire management that involves tribes as leaders leads to better ecological outcomes of these projects. In addition, collaborations with tribes have many social, economic, and cultural benefits, including creating jobs and leading to a sense of connection to ancestral practices and well-being and intergenerational transfer of knowledge, and a variety of other benefits that are not typically seen in agency-directed restoration and fire management projects. Furthermore, working with tribes means that there is an increased capacity for fire, for the application of fire in landscape management. Tribes are often the only infrastructure in a lot of very rural areas across the Southwest and California, and they possess also a unique expertise in the application of fire. And today there are very few people who are skilled in the application of fire, since most of our resources have been directed at putting out fires rather than intentionally using fire as a tool for restoration. Lastly, tribes have a long-term commitment to the health of the landscape, and they bring a holistic and multidisciplinary perspective that is critical to the long-term success of wildland fire management. In conclusion, collaborations that involve tribes in the restoration of healthy forests and healthy fire regimes meet cultural, social, and economic needs, as well as improving biodiversity conservation, the climate resilience of our landscapes, and long-term carbon storage in our forests.
Thank you, Chris. These images are of a field trip that I did with my Native American Studies 161 course, California Indian Environmental Policy. We were able to go meet Ron Good, who is North Fork Kimono. He's in the center here, and his wife. And we were able to work with him to conduct a traditional burn. And we've done this now 2 years in a row, and we're actually creating a separate class on traditional burning. And it was very exciting. He showed all of us how to trim these plants, which are all traditional basketry plants, and then pile the brush on the plant, and then actually light it on fire, do raking and manage the burn. And then this was some of the results. And there are even more pictures that show the wonderful growth of wildflowers and fresh, straight shoots on the basketry plants that resulted from the burn. So it was a wonderful opportunity. There's also a YouTube video that I can provide the link to of our class's experience working with Elder Ron Good. So we've showed a few resources in this presentation. These are some of the many resources we plan to include in the curriculum module we're developing for the NxTerra site. I show here the Yurok Tribe Climate Change Prioritization Plan as an example of one of many different tribal climate change plans, in collaboration often with the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, which is itself a wonderful resource. I have the logo here. They have a page dedicated to climate change, a series of pages highlighting Indigenous voices and Indigenous leadership. I also point out the National Climate Assessment and the California Climate Assessment, both of which have specific chapters that focus on tribal and Indigenous perspectives on climate change impacts and resilience and adaptation and mitigation actions. And it's not just in those chapters, but in other chapters throughout the report, and particularly in NCA 4, in the different regional chapters, in addition to the tribal-specific chapter. So these are some of the resources that we're using. A few take-home messages just about our curriculum and our approach to this work. Indigenous people have developed land stewardship methods in their homelands based on traditional ecological knowledge. They have the longest term, the most in-depth observations of climatic change over time. Climatic change has more significant impacts on Indigenous people who rely on local environments for subsistence, but also spiritually and culturally. So there are higher impacts on Indigenous people than on other populations. Sorry about the spelling error there. And Indigenous people are innovating many diverse climate change mitigation strategies, and they are really leaders in the climate adaptation and mitigation space. And as such, they should always be at the table in land stewardship responses, planning and responses to climatic change. So thank you again for listening to us speak about this module and our work, and we look forward to hearing from you if you have any questions or suggestions, and we hope to have our module up on the NxTerra site certainly no later than September 2019, and we look forward to your thoughts and contributions and questions, and we hope people will utilize the module in teaching about climate change and underscoring the importance of Indigenous knowledge in analyzing climate change and responding to climate change, particularly from a perspective of equity and justice. Thank you.